Gideon Mercer did not knock. He shoved the cabin door open and slapped a folded contract on the table. "Sign it, boy, right now." Eli Carter, 15 years old, looked up from his father's chair. "This land isn't for sale, sir." "Sale?" Mercer laughed, cold and short. "A black kid doesn't own land in this valley. He borrows it, until men like me want it back. Sign or the sheriff drags you out by Friday." Eli looked at the paper, then at the 80 starving hogs outside, the ones the whole town mocked him for buying with his father's last $25. He folded the contract in half and held it out. "Then send the sheriff. If that were you, orphaned, broke, hated, what would you do?" Stay with this story because what Eli Carter did next did not just save 43 acres of dying clay, it brought the soil of an entire valley back to life. If you are new here, subscribe and follow this journey all the way to the end, and drop your city and country in the comments below because a story like this deserves to travel far. Now let us go back to where it all began. The morning Eli Carter buried his father, the sky over Caldwell Basin was the color of old bone. Not the dramatic charcoal of a proper storm, just that flat, tired white that means the sun has quit trying. 3 people came to the service. The preacher, who left the moment the last word was spoken. Old Nettie Crane from the neighboring parcel, who stood at the edge of the grave with her hands folded and her face unreadable. And Eli himself, 15 years old, standing in a coat 2 sizes too big because it had belonged to the man going into the ground. Thomas Carter had spent his whole life working other men's fields. 20 years of sharecropping, of planting cotton and corn he would never own, of handing over shares that somehow grew larger every season while his own portion shrank. And through all of it, he had saved. Nickels, dimes, folded dollar bills sewn into the lining of a work boot. It took him 2 decades to gather enough to buy land of his own, and when he finally had it, the only parcel anyone in Caldwell Basin would sell to a black man was 43 acres of cracked clay and gray rock on the eastern edge of the valley. Land that 3 previous owners had abandoned without ceremony. Land the soil itself seemed to have quit on, packed so hard a plow blade would skip across it like a stone across water, bleeding its thin topsoil into the wind a little more every dry season. The town had laughed at him for buying it. Thomas Carter had not cared. He would walk that dead ground in the evenings with his son beside him, crouch down and press his palm flat against the clay the way other men touch the shoulder of a horse. "This land is not dead, Eli," he said more than once, in the voice he saved for things he meant. "It is only waiting for somebody who knows how to listen." Eli had been too young to understand what that meant. Then he had gotten old enough to suspect it meant nothing at all, that it was just the kind of thing a tired man tells himself to keep going. And then, in the first week of September, a fever came through the eastern basin, and it settled into Thomas Carter's chest and would not leave. 50 cents of quinine from the druggist in town might have broken it. They did not have 50 cents. They had $17 in a tin box, and that $17 was the land payment due in November. And Thomas Carter, burning up on his cot, made his son swear not to touch it. "The land, Eli," he said near the end, his voice down to a whisper with gravel in it. "Whatever happens, you hold the land. It is the only thing they cannot take back from you if your name is on the paper." He died on a Tuesday before sunrise. Eli dug the grave himself on the low rise behind the cabin because the town cemetery kept a section for black families and that section was full, and because his father would have wanted to stay on his own ground anyway. 4 days after the funeral, the letter came. A boy from town carried it out and would not come past the gate to hand it over, and across the top of the envelope ran gold-embossed lettering that read, "Gideon Mercer, Land and Property." Everyone in Caldwell Basin knew that name. Mercer's office sat third on the left coming into town, his name painted on the window glass in gold, because Gideon Mercer was the kind of man who put his name in gold anywhere gold would stick. He had bought 6 parcels in the basin in 4 years, every one of them from a family that was desperate, or grieving, or both. The letter was polite the way a knife is polite, all clean edges and precise purpose. Mercer wrote that he understood the boy's unfortunate circumstances. He wrote that a young man alone, particularly a young man of Eli's situation, and that word situation sat on the page doing the work that uglier words usually did, could not reasonably expect to hold and work a parcel of that size. He was prepared to offer $300 for the Carter land, which he called generous given its limitations. The offer would remain open for 60 days, after which he could not promise the county would look so charitably on an unsupervised miner's claim to property. Eli read it twice, standing in the doorway of the cabin his father had built with his own hands. $300, more money than he had ever seen in one place. And underneath the number, unwritten but plain as print, the real message. Take the money and go, boy, because one way or another, this land will not stay yours. He carried the letter to the stove, opened the iron door, and fed it to the fire. He watched the gold lettering curl and blacken until nothing was left. He had no plan. He would have admitted that to anyone honest enough to ask. He had a dead father, a dying piece of land, $17 he had sworn not to spend on anything but the land itself, and a promise. What he had besides that was the specific kind of stubbornness that grows in people the world keeps expecting to quit. Sometimes survival is not a decision. Sometimes it is a refusal, a hard, wordless no that lives somewhere below thought. That refusal was what carried him into Callaway's stockyard on a cold Tuesday morning in the first days of October, 3 weeks after his father died, wearing the too big coat because it was the only thing he owned that still looked like it meant something. He had not gone there to buy anything. He had gone to ask Denton Callaway for work, mucking pens or hauling feed, anything that paid. Callaway was a large man who smelled of tobacco and horse and did not waste words on anybody. And he was standing at the back pen looking at a problem when Eli found him. The problem was 80 hogs. They had been consigned from a farm that went under in August, and they had sat in that pen 6 weeks on half rations because Callaway was not running a charity. They were thin in the way that alarms people. Ribs showing through, eyes gone dull. They moved slowly, which hogs almost never do. A farmer named Ferris Webb stood at the rail beside Callaway, a big man weathered by 30 years of outdoor work, who farmed 200 acres of good bottomland west of town and had driven in specifically to look at these animals. He had already decided against them. "Half dead," Webb said, and turned for his wagon. "Whoever takes those takes a burial expense." Callaway spat into the mud. He was not talking to Webb anymore. He was talking, to his own visible surprise, to the boy standing at the rail. $25 for the lot. I need them gone, not sold. Gone. Eli looked at the hogs. 80 animals. He did not know much about hogs in particular, but he knew hungry, and he knew stubborn, and he knew what it looked like when a living thing had been written off by everyone with the power to decide. In the far corner of the pen, a big sow with one red-tipped ear lifted her heavy head and looked back at him. Not the vacant stare of a starving animal, something steadier than that, something that was still paying attention. His father's voice came up out of the ground and into his chest. It is only waiting for somebody who knows how to listen. 43 acres of clay too hard to plow. No money for seed, no money for feed, no crop possible before the November payment anyway. But hogs did not need plowed ground. Hogs made their own way into the earth. And a boy with $17 set aside for the land could tell himself, standing at that rail with his heart pounding, that hogs put onto the land were the land. 25, Eli said. I have 17 now. I will owe you 8 until spring. Callaway looked at him a long moment, this skinny black kid in a dead man's coat, offering him everything he had for a pen full of dying animals. Ferris Webb, halfway to his wagon, stopped to listen, and then he laughed. Not cruel exactly, just certain. The laugh of a man watching somebody walk off a roof. But Calloway was a practical man, and on some days a decent one. And 80 hogs eating half rations in his back pen was money leaking out of his pocket every single morning. He put out his hand. Eli shook it. And that was how a 15-year-old orphan spent the last dollar his father ever saved, plus $8 he did not have, on 80 animals the whole county expected to die by Christmas. Ferris Webb told the story in the feed store that afternoon. By supper, it had traveled through both saloons and the church hall, and by the next morning, Eli Carter had become Caldwell Basin's favorite cautionary tale. The Carter boy, worse than his father, spent his land money on dying hogs, on that ground in a dry year alone. Gideon Mercer heard the story the same week everyone else did, and he understood something the feed store did not. A boy who spends his land payment is not a boy preparing to leave. So 4 days after the handshake at Calloway's, Mercer drove out to the eastern parcel himself. He did not knock. He shoved the cabin door open like the place already belonged to him, because in his mind, it already did. And he dropped a folded paper on the table in front of Eli. A contract of sale. $300, the same number as the letter, with an empty line at the bottom waiting for a name. "Sign it, boy," Mercer said, not even looking at his face. "A black kid has no business holding this land, and the county agrees with me. Sign or the sheriff hauls you out by Friday." Eli looked at that paper. Then he looked through the window at the 80 starving hogs rooting in the mud of the west pasture. 80 animals every person in Caldwell Basin had laughed at him for buying. He picked up the paper, folded it in half, and handed it back. Mercer's jaw went tight. "Friday comes faster than you think," he said, and walked out. Friday came. The sheriff did not. Because a threat is cheaper than a court order, and Gideon Mercer never spent money where fear might do the work for free. But Eli understood the message underneath the bluff well enough. The 60 days were not a deadline. They were a fuse. The laughing in town went on without him. Eli heard the shape of it whenever he came in for salt or matches, the way conversations tilted when he walked through a door, not stopping, just adjusting, the way talk does when its subject enters the room. He did not argue with any of it. What would he have said? They were not entirely wrong. He had no plan. He had 80 animals to feed and no feed. He tried to buy some. He walked into Haskin's feed store with $2 he had earned splitting wood for the preacher, and Roy Haskin looked at the money on the counter and then looked at Eli and said the store did not run accounts for his kind. And when Eli said it was cash, not credit, Haskin said the sacked corn was spoken for, all of it, every sack in the room, and stood there with his arms crossed until Eli picked his $2 back up off the counter and left. That was how it went in Caldwell Basin. Nobody had to say the word out loud. The word did its work in silence, in sacks of corn that were suddenly spoken for, in prices that changed depending on who was asking. So Eli foraged. Acorn mast from the thin woods on the west edge of the property. Wild roots. Whatever the ditches and the fence lines gave up. He did the arithmetic by candle at his father's table, and the arithmetic said the same thing every night. He could carry maybe 60 animals through the winter that way, not 80. 80 was going to break him, and the 20 he could not feed were going to starve slow while he watched. It was that problem, those 20 animals he could not solve, that put him on the eastern edge of the property on a cold Saturday afternoon when the light was going sideways and gold across the rock. He was not walking anywhere in particular. Sometimes the body has to move when the mind is stuck. He went farther east than he usually did, past where the clay got worse and the rock broke through in gray slabs, and that was where Nettie Crane found him, or where she let herself be found. She was sitting on a flat rock with a tin cup of something steaming, 67 years old, hair the color of creek sand, eyes that had clearly been watching him come for longer than felt comfortable. She had 40 acres on the other side of the line, and she was the only white person in the basin who had ever spoken to Thomas Carter like a neighbor instead of a mistake. "You are trying to feed them," she said, not a question. "Foraging, rationing, counting them at night. Doing what I can." She drank from the cup and studied him over the rim. "You are working against this land, boy, same as everyone who ever quit on it. Your father was the only one who ever said different. And now you are out here fighting it instead of listening to it." She nodded toward the west pasture where the hogs were penned. "Those animals know things about this ground that you do not. A hog's nose goes a foot deep before its feet ever move. They smell water. They smell root. They smell what is underneath. Quit deciding where they eat. Open the gate and let them tell you what is down there." Eli looked back across his property. The west pasture was the only piece of it that looked like anything at all. Everything east of it was the cracked basin, the rock shelf, the dry wash where water had run once and had not in years. "If I turn 80 hogs loose in that basin, I will never gather them again." Nettie Crane shrugged, not like a woman who did not care, but like a woman who thought he was asking the wrong question. "Maybe. Or maybe gathering them is not the point. Maybe the point is what they show you first." She said nothing else. She had said what she meant and saw no need to decorate it. He did not sleep much that night. He sat at the table with his worn-down pencil and his numbers that would not change, and he thought about his father pressing a palm flat against the dead clay, and he thought about the promise, and he thought about how the safe choice and the losing choice had quietly become the same choice. Before first light, he pulled on the big coat, walked out to the pen, and opened the gate. The hogs did not rush. That was the first thing he noticed. He had braced for them to burst out like water through a broken dam. Instead, the red-eared sow came forward alone and stood in the open gateway with her head lifted, reading something in the cold, dark air that Eli could not read. She stood that way for 10-15 seconds. Then she turned east, toward the cracked basin everyone in the county had written off, and all 79 of the others followed her. They did not scatter. They fanned out in a loose working pattern, snouts down, moving across the dead ground like they were reading it line by line. He followed them all morning. They rooted in places that looked exactly like every other place and ignored stretches that looked more promising to his eye. And around midday, the red-eared sow stopped near the base of the gray rock shelf, maybe 100 yards from Nettie Crane's fence line, and she did not just root there. She dug, braced on both front feet, her whole powerful body working, throwing clay up in a spray behind her, and 3 more hogs joined her, and then 5 more. Eli walked over and knelt at the edge of the torn ground. The clay there was darker, just slightly. He put his hand into the hole the sow had opened, and the earth was cold against his palm. Not air cold, ground cold. The kind of cold that means moisture is close. And then he noticed the other thing, the thing that made the back of his neck prickle. 20 yards behind him, in a stretch the herd had torn up during their first hours loose, where hooves and snouts had broken the packed crust apart and droppings had gone into the churned earth, something was coming up out of the ground. Thin, green, alive. Grass, growing out of soil that had grown nothing in years. He looked at the cold, dark clay under his hand, and at the green coming up behind him, and he heard his father plain as morning. It is only waiting for somebody who knows how to listen. The hogs were listening. Now, finally, so was he. Burgess, Nettie Crane found him at the dig 2 mornings later, appearing at the edge of the basin the way she seemed to appear everywhere, as if she had been watching from somewhere comfortable and had simply decided it was time to walk over. Eli had gone down almost 3 feet with his father's old spade by then, and the bottom of the hole held standing water. He had bailed it twice with his cupped hands. It kept coming back. She looked into the hole a long while without a word. Then she crouched, slow, with the careful movements of a woman whose joints filed complaints about cold mornings, and she put her hand into the water at the bottom and held it there.
That is cold,
she said, and the way she said it carried weight that Eli's own voice could not have given it. My husband dug wells for 20 years before his knees quit. He always said this rock shelf was a collector. Rain goes into the ground, the clay pushes it sideways, and if there is a break in the shelf, it pools underneath, sealed away where a drought cannot reach it. Water this cold in a dry October did not come from any surface. It came from deep. It came from something old. I need to dig it out proper, Eli said. I cannot do it alone, and I cannot pay anybody. And even if I could pay somebody... He stopped there, because they both knew how the sentence ended. No white man in Caldwell Basin was going to take a day's wages from a black boy to dig on black land, and there was no one else to hire. Nettie stood back up, using her knees the way of someone planning to complain about them later, privately. I did not ask to be paid. My barn has my husband's tools sitting in it going to rust. Post hole digger with good steel, heavy rope, a hand pump and pipe he bought for a well he never got around to sinking. She looked at the hogs working the far end of the basin, and something crossed her face that was almost amusement, though the feeling underneath it was more complicated. 40 years I have watched people come to this valley, look at this ground, and quit on it. Your father was the only one who never did, and those hogs of yours did not wander out here, boy. I watched them from my fence. They came straight to this spot and they started digging. When something means something, I am too old to walk away from it. They worked 3 days. Eli did the deep digging because his back was 15 and hers was not, and Nettie ran the rope and the bucket from the top. And on the second day, 6 feet down, the seep became a flow. Not a gush. Steady, serious, cold and clear and absolutely real, coming in from the eastern wall of the shaft with a low, patient sound that told you it had been there a long time and intended to stay. Eli was standing in the shaft when it happened, and the water rose around his boots fast enough that he came up the rope hand over hand, and then the two of them stood at the rim and watched the well fill from below. They fitted the salvaged pipe in sections and rigged the hand pump by evening, crooked but functional, and when Eli worked the handle, water came up. He filled a tin cup and drank it. It tasted like stone and cold and distance, like something filtered through rock older than any name in the county. He filled the cup again and handed it to Nettie, and she drank. And neither of them said anything for a while, because some moments earn their silence. But a well was only half of what the hogs had found, and Eli knew it. Every day the herd ranged the basin changed. Where their snouts tore the packed crust open, air and water got into ground that had been sealed like a jar lid for years. Where their droppings went into the churned clay darkened. The first thin grass had become patches, and the patches were spreading, and roots were binding topsoil that used to blow away on every wind. And the 20 animals Eli could never have fed were feeding themselves now, because the ground they had opened was full of root and mast and buried growth that no one had ever let them reach. 80 animals, everyone expected to die, were doing, for free, out of hunger and instinct, what no plow in the valley had ever managed. The land was not dead. His father had been right all along. It had only been waiting. The trouble with finding something valuable, though, is that valuable things get taken. Eli had learned that lesson before he learned to read. So on a cold morning in the middle of October, he did something that took more nerve than opening the hog gate had. He walked up the stairs above the hardware store to the office of Edgar Pratt, the only lawyer in Caldwell Basin, a thin, careful man with tight suspenders and a very organized desk. A man who had, as far as anyone knew, done most of his recent work papering Gideon Mercer's land deals. Pratt looked up when the boy came in, and to his credit, his face did nothing at all. Eli stood with his cap in his hands and asked his question plainly. What does a person own if that person finds water under his own land? And what does that person own if that person is 15 years old? Pratt folded his hands on the desk. In this territory, groundwater belongs to whoever holds the surface above it, provided the claim is developed, documented, witnessed, and registered. First to file holds it. It is called prior appropriation. Then he sat back and looked at Eli for a long moment. And I should tell you two things. Because you walked up those stairs not knowing whether I would even let you sit down, and that deserves honesty. The first is that I have done work for Gideon Mercer, and 2 months ago he asked me detailed questions about water rights in the Eastern Basin. Underground water rights, specifically. The air in the room went thin. Eli kept his face still. And the second thing? The second thing is your age. A minor's property claim can be challenged, delayed, picked apart. But a minor with a court-recognized guardian standing beside the filing is a different animal entirely. Pratt straightened a paper that was already straight. Mercer has bought 6 parcels in this basin, every one from somebody who did not know what they had until it was too late. I am tired of drafting that particular kind of transaction. If you can bring me a guardian and a witness by tomorrow morning, I will have your documents ready, and I will not charge you to say so. But understand me, son, the land office is in Harwick, 40 miles east. Papers only count when they are stamped in that ledger, and I do not believe you have much time. Nettie Crane said yes to the guardianship before Eli finished asking, in the flat, final tone she used for decisions she had already made. The witness was harder, because Pratt had been blunt about that too. The land office would weigh an old woman's signature, but a signature from a respected white farmer with 200 acres would anchor the filing in a way the world, built the way it was built, could not easily dismiss. Which left one name, and Eli drove Nettie's cart to that name's farm after dark, because a visit like this was not one you made in daylight with the whole road watching. Ferris Webb came to his door with a lantern and stood looking at the boy he had laughed at in Calloway's stockyard. Eli did not soften it. He told him about the well, the cold water, the grass coming up through dead clay, Mercer's questions to Pratt, and what he needed signed at 8 the next morning. Webb was quiet so long that the lantern oil crackled. He was a man who made decisions slowly and then never moved off them, and Eli watched him work all the way through this one. I laughed at you, Webb finally said. Told the story in the feed store myself. Half the county heard it from my mouth. I have watched my own topsoil blow east every dry season for 10 years, and I called it weather. You put 80 hogs on the worst dirt in the valley, and it is growing grass in October. I was wrong about you, and I do not say that easy. 8 o'clock. I will be there. They signed in Pratt's office at 8 sharp the next morning, guardianship papers and water claim both, witnessed and notarized, and Eli was on the Harwick Road by 1/2 with the documents buttoned inside his father's coat. 40 miles in a borrowed cart on frost-rutted road. He ate the biscuit Nettie had pushed into his pocket without stopping. The clerk at the Harwick land office, an unhurried middle-aged man named Deems Farrell, looked at the papers, looked at the boy, and for one long, terrible moment, Eli waited to hear that the ledger was closed to his kind, too. But whatever Deems Farrell was, he was a man who worshipped his own ledger, and a ledger does not have opinions. He checked every line twice, stamped the claim, and entered it. Is the time marked, along with the date? Eli asked. Farrell looked at him over his spectacles. Everything is marked, son. That is the entire point of a ledger. 11:47 in the morning, the 15th of October. Eli was back on the road by noon, and he stopped at Pratt's office in the dark to say it was done. Pratt let out a breath that told its own story. Then he said, quietly, that Gideon Mercer had come in at 10 that same morning, asking whether Pratt had been doing work for the Carter boy, and had left for Harwick within the hour, and had arrived at the land office to find himself, for the first time anyone could remember, second. And Pratt had done one thing more, unasked. He had written to the bank that held the Carter land note and secured a 90-day extension on the November payment, on the strength of a registered water claim now standing behind the parcel. The $17 Eli had spent at Calloway's would not cost him the land after all. It had bought him the time to save it. The drought came down on Caldwell Basin in November like a debt come due. It did not announce itself. It was a slow withdrawal, rain that should have come and did not, clouds that built and scattered without giving anything up. The creek south of town dropped inch by inch into a string of bad-smelling pools. Stock ponds went first, then the shallow wells. And then came the part the old men in the feed store spoke about in lowered voices, the part this valley had been earning for 20 years without knowing it. The wind picked up the worn-out fields and carried them away. Ground that had been plowed the same direction season after season, ground packed hard and stripped thin, simply let go. Dust rolled off the western parcels in brown sheets. Farmers stood at their fences and watched their soil, their actual land, the thing their families had bled for, lift into the air and leave. Every farm in the basin was dying by inches that winter, except one. On the eastern 43 acres, the churned, rooted, manured ground held its moisture and held itself down. The grass the herd had raised kept spreading, binding the clay against the wind. Eli marked the water level on the pump casing and checked it every morning before he did anything else. And through November and into December, the mark did not move. The well did not care about the sky. The well was fed by something older than the weather. Gideon Mercer had lost the race to the ledger, but men like Mercer do not stop when they lose. They reorient. And the story he began to move through the feed store and the saloons and the church hall that December was a simple one, because simple stories travel best. There is water in this valley, the story went, and a black boy is sitting on all of it. Your children are hauling water in buckets while he waters hogs. He does not need it. He will not share it. And something ought to be done. The story worked the way such stories always work, by taking one true fact and stripping away everything around it. The $25, the dying animals, the 3 days of digging, the 1147 stamp, until all that remained was, he has water, you do not, and the color of his skin doing the rest of the arguing on its own. Mercer came out to the parcel himself in January. He knocked this time, which unsettled Eli more than the shove of that first visit had, because a man performing patience is more dangerous than a man showing his hand. He stood on the step with his hat in his hands and offered $400. Not for the land now, for the water rights alone, plus what he called a distribution arrangement, with himself managing the infrastructure, setting the pricing, deciding the access. Eli asked him 3 questions. Who controls the distribution? Who sets the price? Who decides which families get water in a drought year and which do not? Mercer answered the first 2 smoothly. On the third, the smoothness cracked, just at the edges, the way ice cracks when the weight on it shifts. And behind it, Eli saw the plain truth. In a valley dying of thirst, the man who owned the water owned every farm, every family, every future in it. No, Eli said. Mercer put his hat back on, and the warmth left his voice the way heat leaves an open door. The people of this valley are desperate, boy. Desperate people convince themselves of things. And when they have been told over and over that a black child is the reason their babies are thirsty, no ledger stamp in Harwick is going to matter much. I am not threatening you. I am describing the country you live in. He walked to his buggy and drove away without looking back. Eli stood in the doorway a long time. Then he did the thing Mercer had not planned for. He hitched Nettie's cart and spent 2 days driving to every parched farm in the basin, knocking on doors that had never once opened to a carter, and telling every family the same thing. The well on the east parcel is open. Bring your barrels. It is free. No conditions, no ledger, no debts. And then he told them the second thing, the bigger thing, the thing that turned everything. Your land is not dead either. Come see what the Hogs did to mine. I will show you how it works, and I will loan out breeding stock come spring to any farm that wants to try it, and you will keep your soil out of the sky. Because Eli had learned something in a year of being talked about. You cannot beat a story with an argument. You can only beat it with a better story. And the version Mercer was selling could not survive contact with the actual sight of a boy pumping water 2 hours in the cold for the same families that had laughed at him, or the actual sight of green coming up through churned ground in the middle of the deadest winter anyone could remember. The Whitfield family came first, embarrassed and grateful, with a wagon and 4 barrels. 3 more families came the next day. By the end of January, there was a loose line of wagons on the East Road most mornings, and Ferris Webb had turned 30 of his own worst acres over to a borrowed portion of the herd, and other men were leaning on his fence asking him questions they were not yet ready to ask Eli directly. Mercer watched his story dying, and so he called a meeting. The town hall was full past the benches on a cold Thursday night in February. 60-some people packed into lantern light and wool coat air, a crowd that had been thirsty for months and had been told there was someone to blame. Mercer stood at the front behind the surveyor's table with 2 men flanking him. Cutter Walsh, a farmer with a long talent for resentment, and a quiet stranger in a gray coat named Hollis Crane, no relation to Nettie, a land agent out of the territorial capital who had been on Mercer's payroll for 2 years. Eli came in with Nettie on one side of him, and the room did the thing rooms did, the tilting of eyes, the adjusting. Some of the people who had filled barrels at his pump looked at the floor. Mercer was good. Eli had to grant him that. He started with the drought, which was real, and the dust, which was real, and the children and the dying stock, and he built it all toward his proposal, a water and soil authority for the whole basin, funded by his own capital as a generous loan, managed by an appointed board, bringing order and expertise to resources that were currently, and here he let the silence do its work, in unreliable hands. And then he said the quiet part out loud, because he had decided the room was ready for it. Ask yourselves plainly, friends, are you willing to put this valley's future in the hands of a black child? The room held its breath. And into that breath, from the front row, came Nettie Crane's voice, dry and precise as split kindling. I have a better question. Whose lawyer wrote that loan paper, Gideon? And what does the interest look like in year 5? Mercer said the terms were being finalized. Nettie asked, finalized by whose counsel, his or the territories? And the half-second he took before answering told the whole room everything, and she sat back done, which was more devastating than pressing on. Then Edgar Pratt stood up from the back corner where nobody had noticed him standing and addressed the hall in the flat calm of a man who handles documents for a living. Since we are asking questions in public, here is a matter of public record. Last April, Mr. Mercer commissioned a geological survey of the Eastern Basin. I have seen the filing. That survey identified subsurface water potential 7 months before the Carter boy sank his well. 7 months, during which Mr. Mercer told this entire community that land was worthless, while offering to buy it from a grieving family for $300. The sound the room made was not loud, but it had weight in it, the weight of 60 people recalculating at once. Mercer said the survey was proprietary business. Pratt said it was in the county record, and anyone present could go read it. And then Ferris Webb got to his feet in the back, hat in his fist, and said the thing no one else in that hall could have said. Most of you heard me laugh at this boy in October, so hear me now. My East 30 was blowing away like every acre you all own. His hogs have been on it 5 weeks, and it is holding for the first time in 10 years. He showed me how for nothing. He has pumped free water for 20 families in this room. Webb looked slowly around the hall. The dust is not that boy's fault. The dust is ours. We farmed this valley to death, and the only person in it who figured out how to bring it back is the one person we all agreed to look down on. Now Gideon Mercer wants you to hand that boy's well to the man who lied to every one of us about what was under it. And I want to know who in this room is fool enough to do it. Nobody was. Clara Whitfield stood and said her family's water had come free from that pump when her children needed it, and that she was ashamed of what she had let herself be told. Two more spoke after her, and neither spoke for Mercer. Mercer tried twice to steer back to his authority proposal, and both times the room gave him the particular silence of people waiting for a man to stop talking. He picked up his hat, said he hoped whatever arrangement was made would serve the community, and walked out with Hollis Crane behind him. Eli drove home that night thinking they had won something, and he was right, and he was also 15. And he had not yet learned that men like Gideon Mercer save their real move for after the crowd goes home. The counterfiling arrived by messenger on a Thursday morning in early March. Pratt drove it out to the parcel himself, which told Eli how bad it was before a word was spoken. It was 2 attacks in one envelope. The first challenged the water claim, arguing Mercer's April survey and his documented attempts to buy the parcel amounted to prior claim on the resource. The second went for the throat. It challenged Nettie's guardianship, challenged a minor's capacity to hold and develop property at all, and petitioned to have the whole matter, land, water, boy, placed under review of the territorial court at Harwick. The presiding judge there was named Aldous Crane. He had ruled for development interests in 4 of his last 6 water cases. And Hollis Crane, the gray-coated man who had stood at Mercer's shoulder in the town hall, was his nephew. The prior claim argument is weak law, Pratt said quietly, standing at the pump with his coat buttoned to the throat. Knowledge without use has almost never held. But weak law in front of a family judge is not weak. And the guardianship attack does not need to win, Eli. It only needs to last. Every month it drags, it costs money. There is one attorney in Harwick who has beaten Aldous Crane on water, a woman named Ruth Solano, and she has won 4 of the 6 she argued in that courtroom. Then he told Eli what Ruth Solano cost, and Eli did the arithmetic in about 4 seconds. And the arithmetic was not close. And the tightening began, exactly as it had been designed to. Word of the filing moved through the basin inside a week, helped along by Cutter Walsh in the feed store, and fear did the rest. A court case, a judge, the chance of being on the losing side of a ruling. 2 of the families stopped coming for water, then a third. A man who had asked Ferris Webb about borrowing Hogs for spring came back and said he had best wait and see. Eli stood at the pump one gray evening in the middle of March and understood the shape of what was closing around him. He could not pay the lawyer. He could not sell the herd before spring market without gutting the one thing that made the land worth fighting for. He could not outweight a man who could afford to lose for years. That night he walked up the low rise behind the cabin and sat down beside his father's grave with his knees pulled up against the cold. He took a handful of the dirt his father had spent 20 years earning and let it run through his fingers. And he said out loud to nobody, "I held it as long as I could." The wind moved across the basin. Down in the dark, the Hogs went on working ground that did not know it was about to be taken. A 15-year-old boy, alone, against a courtroom built long before he was born and built brick by brick to rule against him. He could not win this, not alone. And it was right there, sitting in the dirt in the dark, that the word alone finally cracked open. The idea did not arrive like lightning. It arrived the way water arrives in a dug well, seeping in slow from a place deeper than thinking. And Eli sat with it in the cold dark beside his father's grave until it filled him all the way up. Alone. He had been saying that word to himself for 6 months like it was a fact of nature, like weather. A boy alone against Mercer. A boy alone against the court. But sitting there with his father's dirt still on his fingers, he made himself walk back through everything that had actually happened since October, and the word fell apart in his hands. The Hogs had found the water, not him. Nettie's dead husband's tools had dug it out. Pratt had drafted the papers, refused payment, and bought him 90 days on the land note without being asked. Ferris Webb had signed his name and then stood up in a room full of his own neighbors and spent 30 years of reputation on a boy he had once laughed at. Clara Whitfield had risen to her feet in that same hall and said the word ashamed out loud. 20 families had hauled water from his pump. 30 of Webb's worst acres were holding their soil for the first time in a decade because of the herd. None of it had ever been his alone. Not the water, not the discovery, not even the fight. His father had said, "Hold the land," and Eli had heard it all this time as, "Hold it by yourself, with both fists, against everybody." But that was not what Thomas Carter had done with his own life. His father had saved for 20 years so that something would outlast him. His father had planted a boy the way other men plant trees. Mercer's lawsuit was built to beat one black child in front of one friendly judge. Eli had been preparing to walk into that courtroom as exactly the target the lawsuit was designed for. So he would stop being that target. He drove to Nettie Crane's before the frost was off the fences the next morning, and he laid it out at her kitchen table while her tea went cold between them. Not a boy's claim. A cooperative. The well, the pump, the pipe, and the soil method itself, the loaning of breeding stock, the whole practice of turning hogs onto worn-out ground, all of it held by a chartered community body with member families, an elected board, and costs shared at exactly what the costs were. Mercer would no longer be suing an orphan. He would be suing every farm in the valley at once, white families and a black family together on one legal paper, with Eli as one member among many. Nettie turned her teacup once on its saucer and looked at him for a long moment. "You would be giving up sole ownership of the only thing your father ever left you. You understand that?" "I would be giving up a claim I am going to lose anyway, in front of a judge who is somebody's uncle," Eli said. "And I keep thinking about what my father actually said. He never told me to keep the land. He told me to hold it. There is a difference, and I think I finally know what it is. You hold a thing so it does not blow away. The way roots hold soil. Roots do not own the ground, Miss Nettie. They just refuse to let go of it." He put both hands flat on her table, and they were not a boy's hands anymore, not after this winter. "I have been trying to protect this alone, and that was not just impractical. It was wrong. The hogs found the water. You gave the tools. Half this valley built what is out there. It is time the paper said so." Nettie was quiet the way she got quiet when something had landed in a place words could not reach quickly. Then she said, "Pratt will need 30 families to charter it. You have had 20 at that pump and more asking Webb about hogs. I will sit on the board." Flat. Final. Not a question. "Now go ask Ferris Webb right, the way you asked him the first time. After dark, at his own door with the whole truth in your mouth." The meeting was held on a Sunday afternoon in late March, and it was nothing like the town hall. There was no podium and no man with gold letters staging a performance. Eli held it on the east parcel itself, on purpose, so that every family would be standing next to the thing they were being asked to hold. Rough benches made from boards and fence rails. Coffee, because Nettie brought coffee. The pump standing crooked and real behind him, and beyond it, unmistakable even in March light, the green coming up through 43 acres of ground the whole county had once agreed was dead. 31 families came. The 32nd sent a note by a neighbor that said only, "Count us in. Do what is right." Eli stood up in front of them and did not soften a single thing, because he had decided that people being asked to bind their names to something deserved the truth with the bark still on it. He explained the counterfiling. He explained the judge in Harwick and whose uncle he was. He explained Ruth Solano and what she cost and that he could not pay it, and what a cooperative charter was, and what it changed, and what each family's exposure would be if the fight went badly anyway. It took him most of an hour, and his voice was not steady the whole way through, and he did not try to hide that because hiding it would have cost effort he needed for the words. Ferris Webb asked the hardest question, which had become his role in things. and everyone seemed to accept that it had. If we charter this and we still lose, what happens? Mercer gets control of the water, Eli said, looking straight at him. And likely the method, too, or at least the land it was proven on. I will not stand here and pretend that cannot happen. But if we win, the well belongs to everybody in it at the cost of keeping it running. The herd keeps working every farm that wants it, and no one man ever gets to stand between this valley and its own water again. He waited a moment, then said the last part, the part he had promised himself he would say. And I want to be plain about something else. If we form this, I do not run it. I am one member with one vote, same as any name on the paper. I would put Nettie Crane up for board chair, and the rest is yours to elect. I have been making decisions about this water alone because I had to. I do not want to keep doing it. The afternoon went quiet in the way that means something has landed. Clara Whitfield raised her hand and said, "Then I want to vote." And they voted, out loud, one family at a time, standing on churned, dark earth that had been cracked gray clay a year before, and it went 31-0, and the note from the 32nd family made it 32. For the first time in the history of Caldwell Basin, white farmers put their names on a legal paper beside a black family's name and equal to it in the law. Edgar Pratt drafted the charter in 3 days and filed it in one morning, and when he came back from Harwick, he did not come back alone. Ruth Solano was not what Eli had pictured. He had imagined someone silver-haired and formal. What climbed down from Pratt's wagon was a woman of about 40, with ink-stained fingers and a coat that had seen better winters, who read the entire file, the charter, the original claim with its 1147 stamp, the counterfiling, and Pratt's notes, in 90 minutes flat at Eli's kitchen table while her coffee went cold beside her, reading the way other people breathe. Then she looked up. The cooperative guts him. His prior claim argument was already weak against one filer with documented use. Against a registered community body with 32 member families actively using and improving the resource, it is nearly nothing. And his guardianship attack, which was his real weapon, has gone soft in his hand. Because the question of whether one minor can hold a claim no longer decides anything. The claim is held by everybody. She drank the cold coffee anyway, which told Eli most of what he needed to know about her. He can still push to hearing. Judge Crane can still rule foolishly, judges do, but a foolish ruling against 32 families with regional press watching, and I intend to make certain the regional press is watching, dies on appeal, and Mercer's lawyers will tell him so. Men like him make their money by winning efficiently. Watch what he does when winning stops being efficient. Eli asked about her fee because the problem had not vanished just because everything else had changed. Solano waved a hand, not dismissively, practically. Reduced rate, recovery clause. If the cooperative prevails and the water resource is assigned a market value, I take a small percentage of the first year's revenue. If we lose, you owe me nothing. She looked at him over the cup. This is the kind of case I like. Do not read anything sentimental into it. Mercer did not fold at once. Eli had known he would not, and Solano had explained why in one sentence. For men who lose publicly to people they dismissed, pride and profit stop being the same calculation. His last move was the newspaper. A story ran in the Harwick Territorial Gazette in April, 4 columns, carefully neutral in its framing and carefully poisoned in its facts, describing the dispute as 2 equal claims, and quoting an unnamed area developer's concern that untrained community bodies, and one led into being by a mere boy at that, could not responsibly manage critical resources. Solano read it and sent Eli a note that said only, "Good, he is out of moves." Eli did not understand that until the following week, when a young reporter from the same paper drove 40 miles out to the east parcel unannounced on a Tuesday morning and stood at the fence with his notebook hanging forgotten in his hand. What he had come expecting, nobody ever asked. What he found was this: 3 families filling barrels at the pump in an orderly line. Ferris Webb and 2 other farmers laying new pipe toward the nearest homesteads. Nettie Crane keeping the maintenance log in a hand like engraving. A borrowed portion of the herd working a neighbor's dust-ruined field visible across the line. And behind all of it, rolling away to the rock shelf, acre after acre of impossible green, holding the ground down against the same wind that was still stripping the valley's western farms. The reporter watched for a long while. Then he asked Eli, "Is this the operation that cannot be responsibly managed?" Eli looked at the pump, the wagons, the log in Nettie's hands, the green. "I suppose it is," he said. The story that ran the next week was 3 times the length of Mercer's plant and 100 times more dangerous to him because it was specific. It printed the maintenance costs per family per month, a number so small next to the price of hauled water that it read as its own closing argument. It described the soil method plainly enough that farmers 2 counties away could try it. It ran a photograph of the pump with the boy beside it, and the headline used the word that no one could unprint afterward. The boy and the hogs that are saving a valley's soil. 2 other regional papers picked it up inside a month. Letters started arriving at the Caldwell post office addressed simply to the Carter boy, Eastern Basin, from farmers in places Eli had never heard of, asking how it was done. On the 1st of May, Ruth Solano wrote that Mercer's counsel had contacted her to discuss withdrawing the counterfiling, and that her recommendation was to allow withdrawal only with prejudice, meaning he could never file again, on the claim or on the guardianship, ever. She ended the letter with 2 words, "Your call." Eli wrote back the same day, "With prejudice, not negotiable, official, conclusive." The withdrawal was entered at Harwick on the 14th of May, and the Caldwell Basin Soil and Water Cooperative stood confirmed as sole legal holder of the spring rights, with Eli Carter recorded as a founding member, 1 name among 32. Pratt called it a clean resolution, which was lawyer language for a thing with no loose ends. And that same month, the spring market settled the last of the old accounts. Eli sold 14 grown hogs at prices that made the buyer ask for as many again next year, and with the money he paid the land note in full at the bank, put $8 into Denton Calloway's broad hand with a thank you that Calloway waved off but did not refuse, and dropped what remained into the tin box that had once held $17, which was a deliberate choice, and he knew it. That evening, he sat at his father's table with the confirmation papers in his hands for a long time, feeling 6 months of weight come off him, the way held things actually release. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in stages, leaving him aware of the shape of what he had been carrying only by the sensation of its going. Then he put the papers in the tin box beside the money, and he walked out to the rise behind the cabin, and he told his father it was done. Gideon Mercer left Caldwell Basin in July. There was no announcement. One morning, the gold-lettered glass on the 3rd building on the left was just empty, the office locked, the boarding house paid up, and by noon, it was common knowledge that he had taken the eastbound stage the night before with 2 trunks and Hollis Crane and no forwarding address. People said different things about it. Some said the newspapers had made the basin too bright for the kind of work he did. Some said the numbers had simply stopped calculating in his favor. When Nettie told Eli he was at the pump, and he went still a moment, waiting to feel the triumph he had imagined feeling. It did not come. What came instead was quieter and stranger. He saw something real in this ground before almost anybody, Eli said at last. He just wanted to take it from people instead of building it with them. That is a waste of a good eye. He worked the handle and the water came up cold and clear, the same as always. I am done being angry at him. He cost me a winter of sleep. He also pushed us into building something stronger than anything I could have held by myself. I can hate him for the first part or thank him for the second, and thanking him is less exhausting. Measuring, deciding to say it. Nettie looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in the tone of a woman paying out a compliment she had been keeping in reserve, Your father told me once, back before he took sick, that the best crop he ever raised was you. I thought at the time he was just talking. Men do. Picking up the log, matter of fact. She picked up the maintenance log off the fence post. He was not. Eli turned back to the pump and worked the handle a while without answering, because some things land in a place that words cannot reach quickly, and forcing words into that place ruins it. The rain came back in late May, steady and patient, the kind that soaks in instead of running off. And it was the rain, in the end, that showed the whole valley what the miracle had actually been. Because on the western farms, the tired, packed, unworked fields shed the water like tin roofs, and it ran off brown into the ditches, carrying more soil with it. But every field the herd had worked, Webb's 30 acres, the Whitfield bottoms, a dozen parcels more by then, drank. The churned, rooted, manured ground took the rain in and held it like a promise being kept. By midsummer, you could stand on the rock shelf and read the map of it in color, green wherever the hogs had been, gray-brown wherever they had not yet, and there was not a farmer left in Caldwell Basin who could not see with his own 2 eyes which side of that map his family needed to be on. The waiting list for borrowed breeding stock ran to the next spring. By the following autumn, the cooperative counted 41 member families. A proper iron pump stood where the crooked one had been, and 130 yards of laid pipe reached the 3 nearest homesteads, and a repair fund held enough for 2 winters of maintenance, and a 5-person elected board met the first Sunday of every month in the barn Eli had cleaned out and fitted with decent benches. Nettie Crane chaired it with the economy of a woman who had no patience for meetings that did not end in decisions. Ferris Webb ran the infrastructure committee with the thorough, slightly obsessive care he had once spent only on his own fences. Clara Whitfield kept the records, meticulous in ways that turned out to matter enormously. Eli sat on that board as one member with 1 vote, spoke when he had something worth saying, and held his peace when he did not. And he was, by his teacher's account, the best arithmetic student the Caldwell School had seen in years, with a tendency to argue with premises he found unsound. On the morning of the first hard frost of that second autumn, Eli stood at the fence in the early light, in a coat that finally fit him because he had bought it himself with herd money. The old red-eared sow moved through the silver-frosted basin below, slower now, heavier, with 112 animals adjusting themselves around her the way things orient to what they trust. He watched her cross ground that had once been cracked gray clay and was now dark and soft and alive. And he crouched down the way his father used to and pressed his palm flat against the earth. It was warm under the frost. It was breathing. "You were right," he said quietly. "It was never dead. It was only waiting for somebody who knew how to listen." The sun came over the eastern ridge and lit the whole valley, green field after green field, all the way to the horizon. And the best kind of thing a person can build, the kind that keeps going after, went on growing without asking anyone's permission at all.